Hi everyone, thank you for watching this tutorial video. This is the first tutorial video on how to build a decentralized workflow with LTO. We will be sharing more videos where we will go into more depth on how to build these decentralized workflows. The goal of this tutorial is to show you how to set up a node. I will introduce some key concepts before we start building a workflow. We will use a test-driven development, so we will also write a test for this workflow. And once we've tested our workflow, we will start integrating it into a demo app using our SDK. If you want to run this tutorial yourself, you'll need a few software requirements. These are Docker Compose, PHP for our tester, and Node.js for the SDK integration. You will also need a Git account to be able to download the repository where I've already added some Bootstrap source code. Alright, this is the URL of the repo where you can download the Docker Compose file to run your node and some Bootstrap code. Let's download this repo ourselves and start setting up a node. As you can see here, I've already downloaded the repo, and in the docker.dev file you will find a Docker Compose file which is already set up to download all the necessary services and to run the node. So all you need to do is just run Docker Compose up, and now your node is running. All you need to do now is go to your browser and then type in your URL bar localhost port 3000, and now your node should be returning some status information, and now your node is running. So now we're good to go and start building our workflows which we can run against this node. Before we do so, I'd like to talk to you about three concepts you need to understand before starting to build a workflow. First, we have the scenario, the event chain, and the process. The scenario is basically your blueprint of your workflow. It is described as a finite state machine. Here you see an example of a finite state machine of a door. A door has two states, closed and open, and it can transition between those states by opening and closing. This is how we will describe our workflows as well. All the actions taken in the workflow are logged onto the event chain. This event chain is also stored in the node. It contains all the events leading to new actions in your workflow. It also stores the identities. Identities determine who are allowed to interact with your chain. If an identity includes a public key of a user, and all the events then signed by this public key will be accepted on the chain. Also, the resources that are used on this chain are stored in this event chain. Here you can think of scenario IDs, process IDs, document IDs, and identity IDs. Last is the process. The process describes the current state of your workflow. It includes also possible future states, past actions, actors who are able to interact with the process. So every action can only be performed by a specific actor. And of course, all the data used to run this process is also stored in the process. Alright, now it's time to build our first workflow. To build a workflow which will be run decentralized, we have to understand that all the nodes running the workflow need to work with the same entities. To be sure that everyone's working with the same entities, we use JSON schemas to describe all these entities. So once we start developing the scenario, we first start off with adding the schema which we're using. So we're adding the scenario schema. The second, we just add a title. Now we can add actors. Our first actor will be the initiator actor. It will have a title initiator. Then we can add our actions. The first action we're going to add is the complete action. This action can then only be performed by the initiator. Alright, so now we can add the states. The state that we always need to have is the initial state. This is where the process will start off from. So we're adding the initial state with the allowed action complete, which will lead to the new state called success. As you can see, the success states start with a colon. This means that this is an implicit state. Every workflow has 3 implicit states. The success state, this is when the process is completed successfully. The failed state, this is the state where the workflow transitions in when the workflow exits unexpectedly. And then we have the cancelled state. This is when the user forcefully fails the workflow. All right, so now we would like to test this workflow. We use a testing tool for this that we've already developed, and this tool interprets this Gherkin syntax. So we've created a test which should test whether this scenario that we've defined works correctly. So as you can see, we first set up some background stuff which will initiate the process, and then we can start running the scenario. So in the first line, you'll see that Joe will start a event chain. Then the identity of Joe will be added to the chain automatically. And then Joe will instantiate this basic scenario that we've created and call it the main process. And then Joe is set as the initiator actor on this main process. So now Joe should be able to perform the first action, which is complete, and then the main process should jump into the completed state. All right, let's take a look at how this works. In the repo, you'll also find the live contracts tutorial folder. Inside this folder, we have our tester, which is the lctest.var. And I've already included the scenario in the basic folder. I can show you just here. And I've also added a test in the main feature file. Alright, so now let's run this test. Alright, the test passed, so that means that the scenario is a correct scenario. Now let's expand the scenario and make it a proper one. Alright, we want to add a second actor where the first actor is interacting with. So let's set up a very simple greeting where the initiator says, starts off with a greet, saying, "Hi, how are you?" And then the recipient should respond with, "Fine, how about you?" And then the initiator says, "Fine," and then the process will be completed. Like I mentioned, we're using a test-driven development. So let's first start to create a test. This is what the test looks like. So the background is about the same as the previous test. So the chain is created by Joe. And then the second, Joe will create a main process using a different scenario called the handshake scenario. And then Joe is added as the initiator actor again. Now we're going to add a second actor. Let's call her Jane. And she will be the recipient actor on the main process. Now we can test the scenario. So Joe now runs the greet action on the main process instead of the complete action. This should lead to a second state called waiting on recipient. In this state, Jane is able to reply on the main process, which should lead again to another state. This state is the wait on initiator state. In the wait on initiator state, Joe is now able to complete to run the complete action, which should lead the process to become into the completed state. When Joe now runs the complete action, it should jump into the completed state. I've opened up the repo in my WebStorm IDE. And inside the live contracts tutorial folder, you'll find the handshake scenario, which is now a copy of the basic scenario, and the handshake.feature, which already includes the whole test that I've just described. So let's edit the scenario and run the test and see if we can get it to work. So first we need to add the second actor, the recipient. We'll also give it a title. And then we need to add the extra actions that we would like to perform. So the first action Joe is going to perform is the greet action. So the actor will be the initiator. Then the second actor will do a reply action, which is performed by the recipient. And the last actor is still the complete action performed by the initiator. Now the initial state won't have the complete action anymore because we're going to start off with the greet action. And this will transition in the wait on recipient state. Now we need to define this new state. It will be the wait on recipient state. And this state only allows for the action reply, which then will transition to the wait on initiator state. And then last, we need to define this new state. Let's wait on initiator state. Here we can perform the complete action, which will transition to the implicit success state. Alright, that's the workflow. Now let's test it. So instead of running the main feature, I'm now going to run the handshake feature. And there you go. The test passed. This means that the scenario is developed correctly. I can demonstrate how it looks like if it would have failed. So if we change the last transition not to success but to a failed state, then you will see that the test will also fail. As you can see, the test failed. It was expecting to jump into the success state, but it actually came into the failed state. Alright, so this is how it works. Let's add another extension to our workflow. Now I would like to demonstrate that it's possible to have multiple actions in a state which can lead to different new states. So while it's nice that the recipient now replied correctly, you could also choose to ignore the greeting. And if the recipient ignores the greeting, the process will jump into the cancelled state. Okay, again, let's look at the test first. So the first scenario stays the same. So Joe greets, Jane replies, and Joe completes, and then the process should be completed. But now we can have a second scenario where Joe greets and Jane decides to ignore, where the main process will jump into the cancel state. Alright, now let's change our scenario. So first, we're going to add a new action called ignore. And this can only be performed by the recipient. By the way, I need to change the success state. Alright, so now during the wait on recipient state, we can have multiple actions. But first we need to define which actions are allowed. So the reply is still allowed, and now also the ignore is added. Now we need to define the transitions per action. So the reply action still leads to the waiting on initiator state, but the ignore action should transition to the cancelled state. And again, this is an implicit state. I already added the test for this. It's called the ignore handshake feature. So we can now simply run it again and see if it works. There you go, both scenario passed. All right, that means that we now have created a very nice scenario which we can now try to incorporate in our own application. So that's what we want to do now. All right, we're going to build our own application using our SDK. We currently develop two SDKs, a PHP version and a Node.js version. In this tutorial, I'm going to use the Node.js version to build an application. I've already created some Bootstrap code in the demo app folder, so let's take a look at that. If you open up the demo app folder, you'll see an index.js file with some Bootstrap code. Let's take a look what's here. It starts off with a helper file. This helper file is sort of a wrapper around the SDK with some extra functions to easily create events. First off, we start by creating a key pair for the initiator. This key pair is necessary for two things. First, to sign events, and second, to sign HTTP requests. Every request to the node is authenticated by looking at a signature which needs to be added. The signature can only be sent to a specific event chain if the identity is added to this event chain. So using these keys, we're going to create an event chain. This event chain will be empty, but it will only have an identifier. This identifier will be set randomly unless you specify a seed, and this way the ID of the chain will always be the same. This is convenient for this test so that we can easily delete it because we know which ID we need to delete on beforehand. Second, we need to create a few other identifiers. We will create a process ID so that this will be used later on, and we will also add an ID to the initiator. Again, this will be explained how it's used later on. Then we have two functions to delete an existing event chain. Well, the first time that we run it, it won't be there, obviously. It will also delete the process. This is used when we run it multiple times. It will delete the old one and create a new one so that we can run a clean test. So now we're ready to start adding our first event. Our first event should always be an identity event because the identities added to the chain determine who can interact with the chain. If no identities are added to the chain, nobody is able to interact with the chain anymore. So the first event is always an identity event. Second, we're going to load a scenario. Currently, we only included the basic scenario. So we're going to load the basic scenario and add a scenario event. This way, the node is able to run the scenario, to instantiate the scenario and run it as a process. So now we're able to actually instantiate the process. Here we add the scenario ID and the process ID so that we know what the ID of the process will be. Plus, we'll add the ID of the identity to the initiator actor so that we know that this identity will be this initiator. So when once an action is signed by this public key, we know that this is from the initiator, and he's the only one able to perform the initiator's actions. All right, so now we've initiated it, and now we should be able to add the first event. Let's try to do that. So we have a function called add response event. We'll add it to the chain. We'll use the initiator's account to sign the event. We need to add the process ID so that the event is sent to the right process. and we're going to add the greet action and the response key. The response key is always okay if nothing is defined. As you can see, it's loading the basic scenario, and the basic scenario is the one that we started off with. So now I need to copy the handshake scenario here, so that we can actually test the scenario. Now it's copied. I change this to handshake, and now I run the scenario and see what happens. Alright, the whole chain is returned once it was sent to the node. This means that everything is run correctly. Alright, so now we want to see if the chain is actually present in the node. And we can do this by going to the browser, where we check the status of our node, and adding /viewer. This will lead us to the viewer of the event chain. Alright, so now we need to register first. And registering basically means storing your seed in local storage, which we can then use to log in. So now I will copy the seed that we've defined for the initiator. I will give it a name. And a password. This password is used to encrypt the seed in local storage. And once I click register, I should log in and see the chain that we've just created. There we go. So these are the 4 events that we just sent in. The first event, as you remember, is the identity event. The second event is the scenario event. Third event was the process event to initiate the process. And the last event is the greet action. Alright, so this is just a chain, and now we've got to look at the process. The process doesn't have a viewer yet, so the only way to look at it is by going to the database and see what the actual state is there. Connected to the database, and as you can see, there are 2 databases. There's one which stores all the event chains, and the other one stores all the processes. As you can see, there's one process, and the current state waits on recipient. The previous actions include one action, which is the greet action. So the current state is correct. Alright, let's add a few more actions. So the second action is supposed to be performed by the recipient. But as you can tell, the recipient doesn't have any keys yet. So let's start by creating those. Then the recipient also needs an ID, which we can later use to link to the actor. And we also want this recipient to be able to interact with the event chain. This means that the identity of this recipient also needs to be added to the chain. So I'm going to copy this line into the recipient. And now we have a problem. Because the recipient isn't on the chain yet, he's not able to add himself to the chain because he's still not allowed to interact with the chain. So what we need to do is we need the initiator to add him to the chain. So we're going to let the initiator sign this event. and then the recipient will be added to the chain, and he from there on will also be able to interact with the event chain. So the last thing we need to do is we need to add the recipient ID to the actor, or link it to the actor. Alright, so now the recipient should be able to perform an action. And he was supposed to perform the reply action. Let's see if this works. Alright, it ran successfully. So now let's take a look at the database and see what the current state is. I'm going to reload the process. The current state is now waiting on initiator. As you can see, there are now two previous actions. The first one was greet, and the second one was reply. Alright, now let's add the last action. So the last action is also performed by the initiator, and he will do the complete action. And this should lead to the success state. There we go. Let's check the database again. Reload the process. And the current state is now a success. There we go. And all three previous actions have now been added. Alright. As you remember, we've also created another scenario where the recipient was able to reply with the ignore action. Let's also try that out. I'm going to remove the complete action and replace the reply action by the ignore action. Alright, let's check the database one last time. And the current state is now cancelled as we've expected it to be. Alright, so this concludes our tutorial. Hope you found it useful, and hope to see you in the next tutorials.